Hello, AP Macro students. This is Counter-Cyclical Policies with me, Mr. Sanabria, and today's lesson is Fiscal Policy. So you notice I have switched the name of our course from being AP Macroeconomics, which it still is. We're still in AP Macroeconomics, but I'm calling it Counter-Cyclical Policies because really from here on out, it is a discussion on counter-cyclical policies that is going to dominate this course. So let's just take a brief moment to figure out how we've gotten to this point. Well, I'm not going to go over the Unit 1 stuff so much because that was basic economics, supply and demand, scarcity, production possibilities, all of that. But really in this last unit, we got down to the nuts and bolts of measuring and graphing the macroeconomy. So we learned our three economic measures: price level, GDP, and unemployment, and we know how to measure them, describe them, categorize different kinds of people as different kinds of employment situation. GDP, we know the aggregate expenditure approach to measuring GDP, which is SIGEX, and we know how important consumption spending, gross private investment, government spending, and net exports is, and we put it all onto a graph, and that graph was the aggregate model. Well, I guess it still is. So that graph is the aggregate model, and the aggregate model looks like this, and I have this awesome little, I still have this thing, right? I have my aggregate demand curve on a stick sort of thing, and we've got the aggregate model itself, right, which compares price level, real GDP, long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and I've almost forgot we have to have this full employment. Full employment, that is where long-run aggregate supply is, and right here I'm holding this stick and then showing that aggregate demand is the economy at full production, full employment. It's a nice, healthy, good economy, right? And then we took this idea to the next level, so to speak, and we realized that the business cycle is aggregate demand shifting back and forth. So we have a recession, we have a recovered full macroeconomic equilibrium, fully employed economy, we have inflation, and as aggregate demand shifts back and forth, this is the business cycle. And the business cycle is the enemy, right? Because we don't like recessions, we don't like inflation, we want nice, stable macroeconomic equilibrium characterized by increased production, low unemployment, and stable price level. So now we have measured the economy. We know what we want to see. What happens when that's not what we see? That's what countercyclical policies are for. Countercyclical policies are policies that are meant to counter or offset the business cycle. That's the cycle we're countering, right? So countercyclical policies attempt to offset or counter the business cycle itself. Now, a brief word on countercyclical policies before we go any further. The first thing that I want to describe to you is that countercyclical policies are demand side policies. All of them. Every single countercyclical policy that we will learn in this course is a demand side policy. So there it is in case you needed to see it in marker. Demand side policies. Countercyclical policies are demand side policies. That means that if I'm talking about fiscal policy, which is today's topic, we're talking about demand side policies. If I'm talking about monetary policy, those are demand side policies as well. So what do I mean when I say demand side policies? Well, let's go back to our model. We've identified that the business cycle is aggregate demand shifting back and forth, and it's actually pretty simple. If we're in a recession, a countercyclical policy would attempt to push demand back here to equilibrium. So if we're in a recession, the countercyclical policy is to counter that decrease in demand. By doing what? By increasing demand. And so if we're in hyperinflation, countercyclical policy will attempt to bring demand back, to pull it back to long run. And so all we're doing is doing this counter move thing with the economy. We're in a recession, push demand forward. We're in inflation, pull demand backwards. So what is the tool? How do we manipulate where aggregate demand is. How do we do that? Well, I guess first we need to think about what shifts aggregate demand, and we know this. We know it so well. We know that aggregate demand is shifted or changed by some change in sig x. That's right, our good friend sig x, changes in sig x. Countercyclical policies attempt to change either or some combination of consumption spending, gross private investment, government spending, or net exports in order to either push aggregate demand back to equilibrium or pull aggregate demand back from inflation to equilibrium. So what I'm saying is this: we're in a recession. We want to do policies that somehow increase consumption spending. If we do that, we can push ourselves back. If we increase gross private investment, we can push ourselves back. If we increase government spending, push ourselves back. If we increase net exports, we would push ourselves back. So what I'm saying is any combination of things you can do that would increase sig x would counter the business cycle in a recession and bring us back to macroeconomic equilibrium. And the same is true if we're inflationary. We're going to try to decrease the components of sig x and pull ourselves back. That's all we're doing. That's it. That's what countercyclical policies are. Now, second thing I want to introduce to you, and then we'll get to the slides for the day, is that there are two broad types of countercyclical policies. Okay? There are fiscal policies, and there is monetary policy. And I'm going to draw it like this for you so that you can see it. These are both countercyclical policies. What's different is what they're doing, okay? How they do it, who's doing it is very important. But they are both countercyclical policies, meaning this. The significance here is these are both types of policies that are demand side, that are attempting to counter the business cycle by manipulating aggregate demand. And I keep harping on this because when we learn monetary policies, a lot of you are going to want to try to shift aggregate supply. And what I'm telling you right now is you're never going to shift aggregate supply because of a countercyclical policy. They are both demand side policies. They attack sig x. Now, what's the big difference here? Well, today we're going to learn fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is done by Congress, the federal government. That's who does it. Congress does fiscal policy. Monetary policy is done by the central bank, which is the Fed. Okay? Monetary policy is done by the central bank, which is the Fed. So we have different people doing different policies. These are independent of each other. They are unrelated. The only thing they have in common is that they are both countercyclical policies, meaning they have the same goal: countering the business cycle by manipulating aggregate demand. So today's class is all about fiscal policy. That's where we're going to start. We're going to first learn fiscal policy, and then once we know that, we're going to switch on over to learning monetary policy. So the good news is this: fiscal policy is very simple. Let's get to the slides. All right, so here we are with slide number 1, which is a definition of fiscal policy. And everybody say this with me now: fiscal. Fiscal. It's not physical. It's not physical policy. It's fiscal policy, okay? It has to do with things financial. That's what fiscal is. All right, and what we've got here is government efforts to promote full employment and price stability by changing government spending and taxes. So, hey, full employment and price stability, that sounds like 2 out of the 3 economic measures, right? So what can Congress do? I say Congress because I kind of got ahead of myself, but here we are. This is Congress only. This isn't the president. This is not the bureaucracy. This is not the judicial system. This is Congress, because Congress has the power of the purse, right? To get back to what you learned in government class, all taxing and spending policies come out of Congress, and specifically, they must originate in the House of Representatives. Now, this isn't a government class, so I'll kind of just stop right there. But what's true is this: Congress has the power of writing a budget, which is spending tax dollars, right? That's government spending, and raising taxes. Okay? So if the government were to try to achieve full employment and price stability by manipulating the way they spend money and the way they tax, that's fiscal policy. Now, what's important here is to kind of put in perspective the fact that macroeconomics as a field of study hadn't been invented yet when the Constitution was written, and this idea of fiscal policy didn't come around until around the time of the Great Depression. This is what Keynesian economics is. Okay? So Keynes is the one who comes up with this idea of the government doing these things, taxing and spending, in order to manipulate aggregate demand and counter the business cycle. Okay? That's what fiscal policy is. So now, let's go ahead and take this idea of the government taxing and spending in order to manipulate aggregate demand and think about the two kinds of fiscal policy. But real quick, I suppose I should not assume that you've put this together. So let me go back to our model and illustrate something real quick. We've already identified that this is the business cycle, right? And aggregate demand shifts back and forth because of Sig X, right? What's the G in Sig X? The G in Sig X is government spending, right? So if the government can just simply manipulate the amount of spending and have an effect on aggregate demand, well, that seems like a no-brainer, and that's basically what's going on here, right? So the one thing that the government can actually control, because they can't control consumption spending too well, but we'll see how they try. Right? They can't control investment spending too well. They can't really control net exports too well, right? We're going through Sig X here. But what they have direct control over, literally this is their job, is to spend government spending. That's what they do. And so they have direct control over one of the components of Sig X, which is super important. The other thing that they control is taxes. And what we're going to find is that through changing and manipulating taxes, they do have a lot of control over consumption spending. Remember when we talked about the spending multiplier, we talked about how much disposable income households have, right? And disposable income is your after-tax income. So if the government can just lower your tax rate, you would have more disposable income and you would spend more. So the government really can control 2 out of the 4 components of Sig X by manipulating taxes and changing government spending. So now onward to these 2 kinds of fiscal policies that we have. All right, the first kind is expansionary policy. And that is a policy that's meant to counter a recession. So what's the opposite of a recession? An expansion. And so what we're trying to do is to even though our economy is down here in a recession, I know this is small, but just track that. All right, we're down here in a recession. If we can expand the economy, expansionary policy brings us out of the recession. That's the idea. Okay, how do we achieve that? Well, increase government spending, because now all we're doing is increasing G, we're increasing government spending, and decreasing taxes. I already kind of illustrated that relationship to you. Households get taxed less, they spend more. So what are we actually trying to manipulate here? We're trying to manipulate consumption spending and government spending. Okay, so we have Sig X, right? These are the components of GDP. And what I'm saying is expansionary fiscal policy increases 2 out of the 4. That's what I'm saying, right? Now, the consumption spending is by way of decreased taxes, and the government spending, well, that's easy because they just increase the amount of money that the government spends. The other is contractionary policy, and it counters inflation. What's the opposite of inflation? A contraction. Slow the economy down, pull the economy back, and hey, why not? I'll keep showing you. I did make this awesome little model, so I might as well continue using it. Here we are at inflation, and we're in a contractionary policy to bring it back. Okay, so inflationary economy, contractionary policy. And all we're doing now is, instead of increasing consumption spending and government spending, we're going to go ahead and attempt to decrease government spending and consumption spending. Consumption spending would decrease by way of increased taxes. Government spending would decrease by way of simply the government spending less money. Pretty simple, right? These are pretty simple relationships. Fiscal policy is not actually very difficult. Okay? We've already graphed it, so we're going to go ahead and continue on with the notes. You should, in your notes though, go ahead and pause. If you haven't graphed these things, go ahead and graph your aggregate model and show aggregate demand increasing for a expansionary policy and decreasing for contractionary. We have these other ways of categorizing fiscal policy. Okay? There's discretionary fiscal policy, and there is automatic fiscal policy. So discretionary policies are those that are deliberate. They're probably what you're thinking of already. It's when the government notices that there's a problem, so maybe there's a recession. And so Congress comes to the conclusion there's a recession. They decide they want to do an expansionary policy in order to act on that and counter the recession. So they pass a bill that's going to increase spending and decrease taxes. The bill passes, that goes into effect, and they did it at their own discretion. They chose to do it. Okay? That second bullet point is a good one. It's policymakers doing fiscal policy in response to an actual economic problem. Automatic fiscal policy measures happen without policymakers having to do anything. There are laws that are already on the books. They're things that will kick in automatically, as the name suggests, if there's some sort of economic problem. A couple of examples, and these can be a little hard to think about, but you'll see as we talk through this. Unemployment compensation, marginal tax rates, these are examples of automatic fiscal policy. Let's look at unemployment. How is unemployment compensation an automatic fiscal policy? Well, one, it's a law that was signed onto the books, and so it's a policy, and so it is a fiscal policy. But how does it actually counter the business cycle? What happens whenever there's a recession? There's high unemployment, right? If people lose their jobs, well, they are unable to consume, right? So consumption spending goes down when people lose their jobs. But if they get unemployment compensation, they have some money coming in, so their decrease in consumption spending won't be as dramatic as it would be if they didn't get that insurance. Okay? So this actually kind of dampens the blow to consumption spending that you would normally have with higher rates of unemployment. And it happens automatically. Congress doesn't have to argue over this for it to happen. It's going to take place because it's already on the books. Okay? That's an automatic fiscal policy. And really, before we talk about the weaknesses of fiscal policy, what I want you to realize is that's it. That is fiscal policy. You need to understand automatic versus discretionary policy. You need to understand expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. And you need to know that fiscal policy is taxing and spending policy in order to manipulate aggregate demand, and that's by way of consumption spending and government spending. And really, that's it. So we need to now think about what the weakness of fiscal policy is. Okay? And there's this thing called lags, lag time. There's inside lag. And inside lag is the time it takes to recognize that there's a problem, promote solutions, and implement a policy change. We're talking about discretionary fiscal policy here, right? We all probably are aware that Congress isn't super quick at doing anything, right? So there's a good chance that Congress can't actually respond quick enough to enact a policy that will have an effect on the recession or the inflation that we're seeing. Okay? Outside lag is the time it takes. Let's say they do react and they do get laws passed. Well, those laws actually have to have an effect on the economy, which that doesn't happen instantly either. So there's this idea where perhaps Congress, by the nature of Congress, can't, because of inside and outside lag, respond quickly enough to economic conditions to actually have the effect that fiscal policy is trying to achieve. Okay? There's this entire other side of things that is political motivation. And I won't spend a lot of time on this on the video here, but let's just imagine which of these two kinds of fiscal policy are going to be popular, right? We have expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary fiscal policy means the government spending a lot of money on things that government spends money on, which is some sort of programs, right? Government programs, which are usually popular with people because they help you. They build roads, they create jobs, they do all these things that these government programs do. And they also cut your taxes so that you spend more. You have more spending money. That's super popular, okay? People have more money, so their taxes are low, and the government's spending money on all these programs. By the way, we're being politically neutral here, because who likes the government spending in terms of politics? Generally, the political left. Who likes the tax cuts as far as policy politically? Generally, the political right. So these are both popular, and they're both popular with either political party. Well, let's look at contractionary policy. How popular is that going to be? We're going to cut the government programs because that's what the government spending is. We got to cut government spending. And also, guess what else we're going to do? We're going to raise our taxes. That is unpopular with everybody. Again, politically neutral. The political left is not going to like the government cutting programs. The political right is not going to like the government raising taxes. So there's this huge political hurdle to ever doing counter-cyclical policies that are contractionary. And it seems, and kind of history bears this out, that we only do expansionary fiscal policy and we never do contractionary fiscal policy. Now, we do need to understand why that's a problem. And maybe you've already noticed this. What is the government doing when they do expansionary fiscal policy? Well, they are simultaneously, meaning at the same time, they're cutting taxes, so they're making less money. They're bringing less money in, and they're increasing spending. So more money's going out. So we're spending more while we're making less. That is what's known as a budget deficit. Okay? That is a budget deficit. The government, in order to do expansionary fiscal policy, has to fund that policy, meaning it gets paid for by deficit spending. That is government debt. Okay? That is government debt. Now, how do you square this idea that the government is going to fix the economy by simply going into debt? A lot of people will make that argument, and it doesn't even sound like it makes sense, right? When you put it this way, it doesn't sound like it makes sense. Well, here's the other part. Government spending increasing and taxes decreasing is expansionary policy. The idea is that whenever the economy has recovered and you're starting to get those inflationary pressures, that you would then do counter-cyclical policy that is contractionary. So contractionary policy means you're bringing more money in, right? Taxes go up while spending goes down, and that is a surplus. That would be a budget surplus. And the idea is that you use the surplus to pay the debt. So what we have here is this understanding now that in order to pay for an expansionary fiscal policy, the government has to go into debt. That's okay, because whenever the economy is recovered and getting into those inflationary pressures, we're going to need to do a contractionary policy, which includes and involves creating government surplus. So you have these budget surpluses, and what you do with the surplus is you pay off the debt from before. And it all balances out, successfully countering the business cycle, right? So that's the theory. However, I already described to you how unpopular it is politically to do a contractionary policy and how popular it is politically to do an expansionary policy. And what we've seen is that we're kind of stuck politically in expansionary mode. We don't ever do contractionary fiscal policy. At least it's very rare. Not enough to counter the effect of the expansionary policy. So we have seen increased government debt over the decades. And so that's kind of the criticism of fiscal policy from a political kind of policy standpoint. The idea of lags, how quickly is it in reality, is the government really able to respond? So that is a question of how effective we can be at doing the fiscal policy. And then there is the other idea of the motivation just isn't there to do contractionary fiscal policy when it's needed. Now, there's another criticism of fiscal policy, and this is more of an actual academic, economic argument against fiscal policy, which is called crowding out. Now, this is a little bit of a complicated relationship, but in order to learn it, we need to first understand the loanable funds model. So we're learning a new model right now. We're going to learn the loanable funds graph, so let's get to that. Okay, so what we need to do now is kind of interrupt the slides for a second to learn a new model, and this is one of the models that we're going to be responsible for. You need to be able to draw this for FRQs and whatnot. But it's really useful, and it's very simple. It's called the loanable funds graph, okay? It's the loanable funds graph. And what we're doing is we're just drawing a supply and demand graph for loans themselves. Because remember, loans have a cost, right? What's the cost of a loan? It's the interest you have to pay on it, right? So anything that you buy, anything that has a cost, is subject to the laws of supply and demand. So loanable funds, or loans themselves, loans, are no different, right? Loans are no different than any other thing. It could be tacos, but this time it's loans. And so the cost of a loan is the real interest rate. So real interest rate is our price, and we have supply and demand, just that classic X in the middle. And then, of course, you have the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, that's a Q subscript with LF right there. So you have the supply and demand of loanable funds. The price of a loan is real interest rate. The quantity of loans is the quantity of loans. So what's important about this? What happens? Well, it tells us how real interest rates change. That's super important, actually. Okay, because if demand for loans goes up, what just happened to real interest rate? Yeah, you got it. Real interest rates just went up. Okay? The demand for loans goes up, real interest rates go up. If the demand for loans goes down, real interest rates go down, and supply, etc. So the loanable funds graph is actually, that is it. That is all there is to it. You do need to know the graph. You need to be able to draw it. But I think you're going to find it's not too difficult to draw the loanable funds graph. You do need to memorize that we're talking about real interest rates, and we're talking about the quantity of loanable funds. You should label it loanable funds, supply, demand. This is what you should draw if you're asked to draw a loanable funds graph. Now, how is this going to apply to fiscal policy? Why am I telling you this right now? Well, whenever there is an increase in the demand for loans, right? If there's an increase in the demand for loans, what happens to real interest rates? I just drew it. I'm going to draw it again. An increase in the demand for loans drives up interest rates. How does the government fund expansionary fiscal policy? And remember, that's our problem, right? Because expansionary fiscal policy is increased spending by the government at the same time that they're decreasing taxes, which means the government has to borrow money. That's that deficit spending. So the government borrows money to spend during expansionary fiscal policy. And that is an increase in the demand for loans. So fiscal policy looks like this on the loanable funds graph. Expansionary fiscal policy is an increase in the demand for loanable funds because the government is demanding more loans. And that increase in demand for loanable funds increases real interest rates. Now, it's important at this point for me to kind of pause for a second and let you know that this is known as the loanable funds theory of interest rates. And it's debatable. Economists don't necessarily agree about this relationship, but if you were to subscribe to the loanable funds theory of real interest rates, then you would say that government borrowing in order to fund deficit spending drives up interest rates. And that relationship, that idea, is what leads to crowding out, which is where we're going to go now. What crowding out suggests is that by the government doing expansionary fiscal policy, they're raising interest rates. And because interest rates go up, gross private investment is going to go down, and so is net exports. And we have to kind of draw this relationship out and really describe this somewhat complicated cause and effect relationship that leads us to that conclusion. So what I want to do real quick is talk about what we're trying to accomplish, and we'll just use expansionary fiscal policy for this argument, because normally we're talking with crowding out, it's a reaction against expansionary fiscal policy. So we have Sig X, and we're in a recession, so what we want to do is we would like to counter the recession by having an expansionary fiscal policy. Pop quiz, what is the government going to do in order to enact an expansionary fiscal policy? Hopefully you said lower taxes, because that's going to increase consumption spending, and also increase government spending because, well, for obvious reasons, right? We got 2 out of the 4. That's great. That's a great policy. What crowding out says is this: in the process of doing this, of increasing government spending and decreasing taxes, and doing the deficit spending, you've got to borrow all of that money. And when you borrow all that money, you are actually increasing the demand for loanable funds, which moves the demand curve outward, increasing the price of loans. The price of loans is interest rates. And so if interest rates go up, investment spending goes down. And let me clean that up a little bit. And I'll even use a color. I'll use red to illustrate that this is a decrease. So, because the government is borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, the idea is that they're driving up interest rates because of supply and demand, as illustrated by the loanable funds graph that we just saw. Okay, so the government is crowding out private investment. That is why it's called crowding out. Now, the relationship that gets us to net exports decreasing is a little bit more complicated, but we learned when we talked about Forex that interest rates have an effect on foreign investors, because when interest rates are higher, foreign investors demand more currency because they're attracted to the bigger returns on investment. And so if our currency appreciates because there's more foreign investors demanding our currency, then if our currency appreciates, how does that affect net exports? Net exports goes down. So what the critics of fiscal policy will point out, using the crowding out argument, is that yes, you increased consumption spending and government spending, but it was at the expense of gross private investment and net exports, and so it just cancels itself out. That's the criticism. Now there's room for argument here, and economists don't agree. This is what now we're getting into, because we're talking about policies, we're going to get into policy disagreements. And what I'm giving you is just the broad understanding of what economists are trying to accomplish. There is a counter argument to crowding out that goes from either not recognizing that it exists in the first place and basically denying the loanable funds theory of the economy, which is what we learn and illustrate with the loanable funds graph. You can deny that that relationship exists. Or you could simply say that, hey, okay, yeah, maybe crowding out exists to a certain extent, but hey, consumption spending is 70% of GDP. So we're going to get more bang for our buck increasing consumption spending than what we're going to lose with gross private investment. And then there would be the counter argument, well, but gross private investment is very important because it leads to capital formation and long-run economic growth. And so we have gotten ourselves into now a policy debate, right? And whether or not we should do these policies becomes normative economics. But what we're given here, what I've just shown you, is the economics behind these arguments. Okay? So let's go ahead and go through this. And I'm going to write out basically what I've already described to you. So fiscal policy leads to deficits. We've got that, right? We have to borrow in order to pay for an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay? Here's a very long explanation of what of what crowding out is. It's a possible side effect of expansionary fiscal policy that's caused by the government engaging in deficit spending. In order to fund these deficit spending, the government has to borrow money. This increases the demand for loanable funds. It increases the real interest rate or the cost of borrowing. Okay? And if the cost of borrowing goes up, then gross private investment goes down. And so we have this relationship here. These symbols briefly describe crowding out and the effect on gross private investment. This next string of symbols is more complicated looking, but it is that effect on net exports, right? Real interest rates go up, demand for the dollar increases because foreign investors want the dollar. The dollar goes up, which is appreciation. Net exports decreases because exports decrease and imports increase because our goods and services are now relatively more expensive. And that leads to a decrease in net exports, and a decrease in net exports is a decrease in aggregate demand. So what we're doing is, in terms of the aggregate model itself, if we were to graph crowding out, we would say that we're right here in our recession. We do an expansionary fiscal policy, and that brings us here, but the effect of crowding out pulls us back a little bit. So maybe the fiscal policy had some positive effect, but it was counteracted a little bit by crowding out. So goes the argument of crowding out. And you're responsible for it. And it is a little bit of a complex argument, but make sure that in your mind and on paper if you need to, you can work your way through both of these relationships. The more important one in terms of what comes up the most is this first one, which is much more simple. Real interest rates go up, gross private investment goes down. It has a negative impact on aggregate demand. But the more complex argument for decrease in net exports is also something you're responsible for. And that's it. That's our slides for the day. So you absolutely need to understand fiscal policy in terms of taxing and spending policy and how they affect consumption spending and government spending, which one's expansionary, what is contractionary. You need to understand the loanable funds graph now, and it's going to go in our big chart, and you need to know what fiscal policy looks like on the loanable funds graph, which is the demand for loans. Okay? And you need to be able to take that understanding of the change in demand in loans, changing the real interest rate, and apply the change in real interest rate to a change in investment spending and a change in net exports, which has a counterbalancing or counteracting effect on fiscal policy. So kind of a lot, but it's all doable. It all makes perfect sense. And until next time, happy studying.